All right, so you just saw or read about a lesson that included explicit language instruction. It supported students in engaging with the content through using a specific language form or language. Remember, we teach language to support students in being able to express their understanding of the content. So now let's unpack that lesson. So, three strategies that you saw during that lesson include modeling, choral repeat, and interactive guided practice. I'm going to unpack each of these in just a moment. However, I want to highlight that this mini lesson should only take 12 to 15 minutes. This is the I do portion of your lesson. So whether you're in an ELD class, a co-taught class, or a rigor class, this should only take 12 to 15 minutes and should be embedded in your mini lesson. It's also important to note that we don't just want it to be teacher talk. You notice that students were interacting during that whole mini lesson to practice the language with the content. I also want to highlight that ideally, explicit language instruction happens in a synchronous setting. And so ideally you're doing this remotely in person or through live streaming. You're doing this live so that students have a chance to practice the language and you can support them in practicing that language. So let's jump into these three strategies. The first strategy that we saw was modeling. It's really important to model language so that students know how to use that language as they're engaging in the content. Without modeling that language, they may not know how to use, for example, phrasal verbs or compound sentences or complex sentences. They may not know how to construct those without seeing you do it first. So with modeling, some strategies that I used were sentence frames. And you can see another example here. If students are comparing and contrasting characters from a novel, I'm providing them a sentence frame where they can use while and whereas to do so. You can also use color coding here. That helps students kind of identify the two different ideas that they're trying to bring together. And lastly, graphic organizers are always a great way to help students organize their ideas so that they can then use the language to express their understanding and learning. All of this can support you as you model language for students prior to having them use that same language collaboratively or independently. Next, we have choral repeat. So you saw throughout the lesson, either you read about it or you saw me modeling it, that students repeated, or I asked students to repeat the key language forms over and over and over again. The more that students practice language orally, the more likely they are to use that same language in writing. So this can be done remotely, in person, or through live streaming. You simply have students repeat after you. They can repeat the language to their dog, to their couch, to their mom if they're at home, or they can repeat that same language with you in class. The oral practice, again, supports students in becoming familiar with the language form and then being able to apply the language in writing. The last strategy we saw was interactive guided practice. So it's important, again, to note that during the I do, students should have the opportunity to practice using the language with your support prior to collaborative and independent work. This has been a big challenge in a remote setting, but we're finding that the best way to do this is to provide 1 to 2 examples for students to practice with. And you can use Pear Deck or even just the chat box in Google to have students practice that language. We don't want them to go to a completely different platform or have to have lots of different clicks before we get there. Ideally, this is just a quick moment during the lesson where they can practice that language. You'll then note that in the lesson, once they've written their response, I called on a student to share their response. This allows students, again, to practice the language orally, and then also to get feedback from their peers and from me as the teacher. Another way that I involved students, the rest of the class, as one student was sharing out, is they had to listen closely and then agree or disagree with what they heard from that student. Again, this pushes students to listen for the language that we're teaching for that day, to think critically about the content of the student's response, and then to respond using the sentence frame if they agreed or disagreed. So again, these are 3 easy strategies that you can use: modeling, choral repeat, and interactive practice to support students in practicing a new language form in order for them to be able to express their learning or understanding of